Hi, in today's video I'm going to be covering an issue I came across where SSH keys weren't working with the Emacs client and programs like Magit and Tramp. Although they were working inside Emacs, they weren't working inside the Emacs client. So what you have is you've got Emacs, which can be started in a server mode, and you can then use another program called emacsclient to connect to Emacs, and this makes using Emacs faster. There's a couple of ways you can start the daemon, the server. You can start it with emacs -- daemon on the command line. You can use server start in your Emacs config. You can actually start the server with the Emacs client. So if Emacs isn't running, it will start the server and then connect with Emacs client. And what I wanted to show you is that there's actually a difference between how variables are handled for things like SSH. So if you're using SSH, what you need to do is actually start the ssh-agent, and you can do this with things like systemd, which is what I'm using. And then once it's running, what you do is you run ssh-add and then press enter and then add your password, and that will allow you to use SSH on your system without requiring you to use your password every time. And this can be picked up by programs like Emacs to be used with things like tramp and magit. Tramp allows you to connect to servers using SSH, and magit is a front end for Git that allows you to push your repositories to GitHub and other places from within Emacs without prompting you for your password. So what I'm going to do is show you Emacs isn't running at the moment. I haven't got the daemon running. I haven't started Emacs with my window manager, anything like that. So all I'm going to be doing is starting Emacs from my application launcher. So what I wanted to do was go through a couple of things. What we have is in our ZSH env file, what we have is export shush or socket equals xdg runtime ssh-agent socket. And what this does is if I run echo shush or socket, it gives me the path to the ssh-agent socket. Now Emacs can now use this information so that it can connect over shush without prompting you for the password. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start up Emacs by opening the Emacs client. And what this has done is Emacs wasn't running. So if I come across here and run pgrep Emacs, you'll see there's two processes running here. And I just want to show you this. So what we've got is we've got the Emacs client that's running, which is the application you can see here. And we have got the Emacs daemon running. So what's happened is Emacs wasn't running. We've started the Emacs client, which then has launched Emacs as the daemon. So I'll get into why this is actually important. So if I now close this window here and run psox grep Emacs again, you'll see that the client is no longer running, but Emacs, the daemon, is. So what I wanted to talk about was how the SSH variable for your shush socket is used in Emacs and the Emacs client, and why it doesn't work sometimes. And this is all to do with the parent process. So as I said, what you can do is you can start Emacs in a variety of ways, from your window manager using emacs -- daemon, using server start. You can use systemd, but I'm going to explain why you don't want to use any of those methods, because it actually causes this issue with the shush keys not working with Emacs client. So if I could come across here and I'll just open Emacs, I'll show you that I can actually connect over tramp. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go find file at the root directory, and what you do is you run ssh:, and you can see it's now picking up the shush servers in my shush config, and I'll show you the bit of code in my emacs file for that. If I run Mac Mini, you can see it's actually connected here, and I'm logged in without using my password because it's picking up the shush or socket variable which tells it where the shush agent is running, and so it knows, okay, I can just use that and not be prompted for the password. So if I kill this window here, and what I'll do is start up a new window using, I have this window set up as a what do you call it, floating, scratch pad. That's it, that's the word I'm looking for. So this scratch pad is started using xmonad HS. Okay, so you can see here Emacs isn't started with xmonad, and what I've got down here is a bit of code that actually starts an Emacs scratch pad with a keyboard shortcut, basically. And what I wanted to show you is that this window here, shush Mac Mini, is also connecting. So you can see this Emacs client that has been spawned using xmonad is still able to connect over SSH to my server. Okay, so what the issue is the way you start Emacs. As you can see here, pgrep emacs, the daemon is running because it's been started when I launched the Emacs client from my application launcher. So what's happening there is the application launcher's launching the Emacs client. It starts the Emacs daemon, and so when you launch the Emacs client, that is the parent process. So what it's doing is Emacs client is inheriting the variables that Emacs is picking up, and so it's able to use the SSH auth socket variable and connect over SSH. Now, if you start Emacs, for example, with systemd, systemd doesn't pick up your variables from your bash profile or your zsh. It uses profiles from .config, environment.d, and files in that folder to actually set the variable. So it's not going to pick up stuff. So that's why you can have an issue with systemd and the Emacs, because what happens is the Emacs client, the parent process it's not picking up the variable. It's a bit confusing, I know. So basically you set your SSH password with the ssh-add, that gets added to the ssh-agent, that creates the shush auth socket, which we export in our zsh env file. Okay, so we export that and Emacs can then pick that up. What happens if you start Emacs with, say, emacs-daemon in your window manager config file? What happens is that process is then owned by the window manager, and when you're running the Emacs client, it's not its parent process, and so it's not picking up the variables from it. So the safest way I've found to actually launch Emacs so that the Emacs client will pick up the variables is simply using your application launcher. So again, I'll kill Emacs, if I can spell Emacs. So Emacs isn't running. And now when I launch Emacs here, you can see this is launching the Emacs client. You can see it's taking takes a second or so to actually launch. And that's because it's trying to connect to Emacs and it's not running. So it then starts it in the daemon mode. And what this allows it to do is, that means that the Emacs client here, its parent process is Emacs, and it can access all the variables from within Emacs, like the ssh-auth socket and stuff like that. And so programs like magit and tramp will actually work. Whereas if you start it with systemd or your window manager, the Emacs client doesn't have a parent process with the correct variables. It's all a bit, does your head in a bit. But that's basically why the issue happens, because of the way you launch Emacs. Now, the other thing I want to actually show you is how you can hide Emacs from your application launcher and why you want to do that. So as I said, you've got two programs. You've got Emacs and you've got the Emacs client. You don't actually want to start Emacs directly. You want to start the Emacs client, which then starts Emacs. So what I'm going to do is, Emacs is now running as the daemon. So when I start Emacs, you see it starts instantly because it's using the client and connects to the server. So what I'm going to do is actually show you local share applications Emacs desktop. Okay, so this is the desktop entry for my version of Emacs, and I install Emacs with Nix PKGs, which are covered in a previous video. So I'm running Ubuntu 22.04, which obviously has older packages and stuff. Using Nix PKG, I can install the latest version of Emacs. So I'm running 28.1, and this is the application launcher. And what I've done is, at the bottom down here, I've just added no display equals true. So what this does is, this actually, if I uncomment this and Emacs. Okay, so now when I run Emacs, you can see it's listing the current window, but it's also listing Emacs text editor and the client. So Emacs is, Emacs, and this is the Emacs client. So if I put no display true back again and run Emacs, you see now it's just listing these two. It's just listing the current window and Emacs client. And so the reason why you want to do this is because you want to launch the Emacs client from your application launcher and not Emacs, because it's faster. So that's how we can hide Emacs from our application launcher, so that we just launch the client. So if I close that, when I now run Emacs, it's just launching the Emacs client. And you can see how that's much faster. So if I come back here and kill Emacs again, pickle Emacs, you see the first time you start Emacs and it's not running, it's going to take a second to kick in. But after that, it will start the daemon, and so every time you connect with the client, it's going to be faster. So basically, the issue is that if you start Emacs with like systemd, like system ctl -- user enable emacs.service, like that, I can type. What happens is the Emacs client doesn't actually pick up the variables from the parent Emacs process. And again, you can also start Emacs with emacs -- daemon. But just hang on, please. How do you? I can remember how you increase the window size. There we go. It'll be like sys. You can spell this sys CTL, something like that. User enable Emacs service and then start Emacs service. And again, you could use this in your window manager config, emacs daemon. Problem with both of these is this will set the parent process to be owned by the window manager, and this systemctl using systemd to start Emacs. What happens is systemd doesn't actually pick up the environmental variables from things like your ssh config, not your ssh config, your zsh config, your bash config, where you set things, and you have to set variables in a separate place. So both of these methods that I've tried had issues with the Emacs client not picking up your shush password with programs like tramp and magit. And so the safest way is not to start Emacs at all using your window manager or systemd, but to simply set your let's see. So in my zsh config, what I've got is exporting the, where is it? Yeah, export the shush auth socket, xtg runtime directory ssh-agent socket, and then we set the export alternative editor, and visual. So those are things we do, and then we also have the .config systemd user ssh-agent. So this is how you start the ssh-agent using systemd. So you've got the unit description, type forking, the environment here, shush auth socket, like that, executive start. So you basically start that with systemctl -- user enable shush. I think it's already done, so it's not picking it up, but you know, like ssh-agent.service, and then you would, oh, for God's sake, and you'd start it with start like that. I think it's something like that. And then again, once you've done that, when you log in, what you do is you run ssh-add and enter your shush password. And once you've done that, it will, if I can find the, yeah, it will set this variable equal to this. So this is the location of the ssh-agent socket. And again, Emacs can then use that to connect with programs like tramp and magit. But the issue is this parent process thing. So the Emacs client needs Emacs as the parent process so it can pick up that variable and be able to use it. Because otherwise what I found is I was running Emacs and SSH was working perfectly with magit and tramp. I could connect no problem. But when I started the Emacs client, it kept prompting me for my password, and I couldn't figure out the reason for it because I'd entered my password and it was working with Emacs. So why is it not working with the Emacs client? And so that's basically the reason, and why you want to actually start Emacs just using your application launcher and not start it in the background. And yeah, it is going to take, the first time you launch it, it's going to take a second longer. So just launching the Emacs client here, and again, this is why we use that bit of code. So we hide Emacs. We just want to launch the client. So we just launch the client. See, it's taking a second. Come back here, pgrep Emacs. You can see there's two processes, the daemon and the client. psox grep emacs, so you can see the emacs client has been started and the emacs daemon is running. So if I kill that, you see the daemon is still running. Now when I start emacs, you'll see it starts instantly because the daemon's running and the emacs client connects to it. And again, we can use the there we go. So that's connected. And again, I can, if I kill this one, what I also wanted to show you again was this is the Emacs client that is being launched with a hotkey from xmonad. So this isn't being launched with the application launcher, the .desktop file. And again, this will also work with the SSH keys, as you can see. So that's how we fix the problem of the Emacs client not picking up the shush keys with programs like tramp, magit, even though it's working with Emacs. And again, the issue is don't start Emacs with your window manager or system D. Basically, just use your application launcher. You're never going to start Emacs from the terminal because it's one of those programs that's a GUI application that you actually do want to use as a GUI because the text rendering is much better and you've got keyboard shortcuts that you can use that you can't in the terminal. So again, basically there's several bits. It's setting your stuff in your ssh config, exporting setting your Emacs client, alternate editor and visual, exporting your SSH keys, shush or socket. And in my emacs.l, I have a section here you can see for tramp. So this is tramp, which is what I've been showing you, how you can connect from within Emacs over SSH to another computer. And one note I would say is what you want to do is there's an issue if you're using the ZSH shell and tramp. What you need to do in Emacs is set the shell that's used by Emacs and tramp to user bin sh as opposed to ZSH, because ZSH gives you problem with the prompt. The prompt doesn't work properly with tramp. So that's what that line is for. Then we've got these lines here which basically parse our shush config. So it basically looks through my shush config for all the servers listed, and then I just type the name of the server and it connects from within Emacs. And this add to this backup directories A list. I think this stops things being backed up that you've opened over SSH. So if you've SSH'd into a server, open something sensitive on the server, it's not going to back that file up on your local Emacs setup. So that's the SSH config in Emacs. And again, I'll show you the command for hiding desktop entries from your menu system. So basically all you need to do is in the menu entry in the desktop entry you want to hide, you just run no display equals true. So capital N O capital D display equals true. And applications, I've done this for a couple of applications. So we've got Emacs there, we've got Emacs capture, which is what I use with org mode to capture stuff, but I don't want it to show up as a desktop entry. It's used to launch the application, but I don't actually want to launch it myself. So we have the no display true here. And again, I got one for the org protocol here, which again was how I use org mode to capture stuff from things like Firefox. And again, I just put no display equals true, because otherwise when I type emacs, it's going to list emacsclient, emacs capture, and org protocol desktop. And I don't want these three things showing up in rofi. So basically when I type emacs, you can see it's listing the actual window here, but it's also only listing the client. So you can see there's the client, and I just type Control X50 to kill that window. And that's the issue that I came across with emacsclient not working with shush keys and things like magit and tramp. And that's basically how you can solve it, is by not starting emacs as a daemon, not starting it with your window manager. Just simply start it from your application launcher. So again, emacsclient, you can see it's connecting to the server. And again, if I kill emacs, so now emacs isn't running. If I start the emacsclient, it takes a second because it's starting the server. This box grep emacs. You can see the client's running, the daemon's running, and so now anytime I once the daemon's running, I can either bring up my emacs scratch pad, or I can just open the emacsclient, and they're going to open nice and snappy. And so yeah, normally you can start the emacs daemon with your window manager, and the first time you launch it, it's already going to be running, so it'll be snappy. But as I said, the problem is it's more difficult to kill emacs if it's started by your window manager, and you get into this issue with the parent process that I sort of tried to describe probably badly, where the emacsclient needs the parent, it has to have emacs as the parent process so it can pick up all the variables, like the shush or socket, so that it can use that to connect with things like tramp and magit. So I think this is the best way to actually start emacs, to be honest. It's got the fewest working parts to sort of debug and fix. So you're not messing with systemd. So if I come across here, Firefox, and just show you wiki. Okay. When it eventually loads up, there's a section on down here. Okay, Wayland. This is to do with Wayland, but it's also because Wayland uses systemd environment variable. So for things like Wayland and programs running with systemd, what you have to do is create a file called config environment.d, like envars.config, and then you put in the variables in there. So this is the sort of section here, and you can also create sort of service files with variables. But we're not going to do that. We're not sort of doing that. We're not starting emacs with systemd because of that, because it doesn't pick up all your variables in things like your ZSH, env. So if you start emacs using systemd, it doesn't pick up all the variables in things like your ZSH config or your profile or your bash profile. So that's why we don't want to use systemd. And also you don't want to use systemd to start your terminal, because then you won't be able to run commands like shutdown, because it's not the parent process is systemd and not the original init. So that's another thing. You don't want to use systemd to actually start your terminal, things like urxvt, things like that, because that will stop you from actually being able to run particular commands like shutdown, things like that, I think, from the terminal. So we don't want to use systemd to start Emacs up, and we don't want to use the daemon either, because then the parent process is the window manager. So by, let me just close that, just by using our application launcher, what happens is it basically uses the Emacs client. Emacs isn't running, so it starts the daemon, and then any time you run the Emacs client, the parent process is the daemon running in this session. So it will pick up all the environmental variables. You're not going to have any issues with Emacs client and tramp and magit not working with things like SSH. So this is a really weird sort of problem that I came across, which has got sort of various parts. You know, you've got your shush, you've got your how you start Emacs, all these different variables, and what the parent process is. But basically, the long and short of it is, just start Emacs using your application launcher, and you won't have any issues with the Emacs client not working with SSH, with tramp and magit. So that's basically the long and short of it. And I sort of was playing around, was been launching Emacs and it was working, and then I launched Emacs client and I couldn't figure out why SSH wasn't working, and it was because I was using emacs daemon to launch Emacs from within xmonad, and because of that, we sort of ran into this issue with the parent process of, the Emacs client being the window, being xmonad and not picking up the variables and all this kind of stuff. So, safest way to basically launch Emacs is not to actually start it with the daemon or systemd or anything like that. Just use your application launcher, and all the variables will then be shared, to the Emacs client, and you're not going to have any issues with being prompted for your password or anything like that. And again, this is the section on Wayland and systemd environmental variables. So again, you don't want to start Emacs using systemd either, because that seems to give you the same problem as well with the Emacs client. So the only way I've found for it to work properly is using the application launcher, and other methods that I've tried have actually given me this issue of bringing up the prompt for putting in your shush password, even though you've added it on the command line. So again, that was several bits to it. You've got your having to do your ssh-add, add your password. Once you've done that and you start up Emacs, it should automatically pick up that setting both in the Emacs and the Emacs client, so that you can use magit and push stuff to GitHub without being prompted for your password. So that's all for now, and I'll put any links under the video.